Upright jerker. Hanging, a method of capital punishment with a troubled history, has long suffered from inconsistencies due to factors like the condemned weight, rope strength, drop length, and executioner skill. In the 19th century, an attempt to address these issues came with the upright jerker, aiming for a more humane execution. Instead of the traditional drop, the system violently jerked the body upwards, aiming for a swift neck break. However, its flawed design often led to prolonged and agonizing strangulation, creating a disturbing spectacle for witnesses. Crushed by elephant. One of the most brutal execution methods was tragically common in regions with natural elephant populations, particularly in South and Southeast Asia. This practice, thankfully eradicated in modern times, involved using trained elephants to inflict maximum suffering on the condemned. The methods varied but often involved the elephant's immense weight crushing the victim's bones and flesh, resulting in a slow and excruciating death. In some cases, the condemned was forced to watch as the elephant approached, adding to the horror of the spectacle. Other regions used a crushing platform where the victim's head was positioned for a direct blow from the elephant's foot. Falling. The urge for immediate and final retribution is a primal human impulse, leading societies throughout history to devise brutal punishments for perceived threats or enemies. One such method is defenestration, the act of throwing someone out of a high window or from a cliff top. Used in ancient Greece, Rome, and medieval Europe, defenestration was a common punishment for criminals and political rivals. The defenestrations of Prague in 1618, when Protestant nobles were thrown from Prague castle windows, sparked the devastating 30 Years' War. While largely obsolete in civilized societies, defenestration is still employed for state executions in some places, like Iran, often filmed and broadcast as a public warning. Scaphism. This was not just a method of killing, but a prolonged torture designed to inflict unimaginable suffering. The condemned were imprisoned between two hollowed-out logs or boats, their bodies captive within this wooden tomb. While the initial force-feeding of a mixture of milk and honey might seem innocuous, the true horror lay in its consequences. This concoction acted as a perverse accelerant, inducing diarrhea, while the stench of decay and excrement became a constant tormentor. Deliberately smeared with milk and honey, the condemned would be left exposed to the elements, becoming a beacon for flies, maggots, and other feeders. These insects inflicted endless bites and burrowed into exposed wounds, adding a layer of unspeakable agony. Death could arrive from dehydration, exposure, or the relentless assault of insects. Scaphism was not merely an execution, it was a systematic dismantling of a human being, both physically and mentally. Poena cullei. Roman law, while influential in shaping legal systems worldwide, included gruesome punishments, like the Poena cullei, or punishment of the sack, reserved for parricide, the killing of a parent or close family member. This method aimed for a slow and agonizing death, reflecting the severity of the crime. The condemned was sewn into a leather sack with live animals, including a dog, monkey, snake, and rooster. As the animals struggled, they inflicted bites and scratches, adding to the torment. Finally, the sack was thrown into water, ensuring a slow and agonizing death. This punishment symbolized the severance of familial ties, denying the condemned a clean and honorable death. White torture. This may evoke thoughts of physical pain, but its true horror lies in the systematic assault on a prisoner's mind and senses. Unlike other forms of torture, it leaves no visible scars, yet the psychological damage can be profound and enduring. It involves sensory deprivation, confining the prisoner to a white cell with white clothes and food, surrounded by silent guards in white. There's no conversation, music, or outside sounds. One case involved Amir Fakhraver, an Iranian citizen subjected to white torture for 8 months in 2004. While the physical discomfort may seem minimal, the psychological toll is devastating, leaving individuals profoundly changed upon release, unable to recall even the faces of loved ones. Strappado. This is a brutal torture method designed to inflict prolonged suffering without necessarily causing death. Unlike quicker methods, its goal is to extract confessions through sheer agony. The victim's hands are bound behind their back, and a rope tied to their wrists flings them high into the air, with hands positioned above the head. This unnatural angle stresses the shoulder joints, often causing dislocation and intense pain throughout the body. Torturers may add weights to the victim's feet, increasing strain on the shoulders and tearing ligaments and muscles. Victims hang in this position until they pass out from pain or suffocate from chest pressure. Drawing and quartering. First documented in England in the 13th century, this punishment was reserved for those guilty of the ultimate betrayal, treason against the monarch. The condemned did not face a swift or merciful death. Their suffering began with being drawn behind a horse on a wooden hurdle over rough terrain, weakening them and inflicting public humiliation. At the gallows, hanging was often employed, but not always fatal. After being lowered, the condemned might be disemboweled, with their organs burned before them. Beheading could follow, severing their connection to life. The final act was quartering, with the body hacked into 4 pieces, sometimes dragged by horses in opposite directions. Gridiron. The torture began by securing the victim to the gridiron, using metal clamps or ropes to bind them to the searing metal. Tormentors might rub the victim with oil or fat, akin to food preparation. As the fire roared beneath, the heat slowly seared the victim's flesh. Compounded by the smell of burning hair and flesh, the agonizing process could last for hours until the victim succumbed to their injuries. Smoke inhalation or shock. Execution vans. China's extensive use of capital punishment covering offenses ranging from tax fraud to prostitution raises significant human rights concerns. The country leads in annual executions, utilizing vans equipped for lethal injection that travel nationwide, disguised as regular police vehicles. Despite officials labeling them as a humane alternative to firing squads, the lack of transparency surrounding their operations is troubling. Critics argue that these mobile units further disconnect the public from executions, potentially devaluing human life. Concerns persist about trial fairness and the risk of wrongful convictions, given the irreversibility of capital punishment. Rat torture. This torture method exploited the fear of rodents and the desperation of a starving creature. A live rat, often diseased or hungry, would be placed on the victim's bare torso within a container with heat applied. The rat, driven by a need to escape, would gnaw and claw at anything within reach, causing immense physical suffering. Yet the true terror lay in the helplessness, knowing your body was becoming a prison for a desperate creature. The excruciating pain, gnawing sensation, and sheer terror could drive anyone to the brink of madness. Keel hauling. This brutal punishment devised by the Dutch Navy in the late 16th century was explicitly reserved for those breaking the harsh code of life at sea. The condemned sailor would be tied with a thick rope, one end secured high on the mainmast of the ship, then tossed overboard. The other end of the rope would drag them underneath the ship's entire length, scraping against the rough wooden hull encrusted with sharp barnacles and algae, leaving bloody wounds. With each movement of the ship, the sailor would be violently slammed against the keel, risking shattered ribs and internal bleeding. Boiling. This was once a cooking method for shellfish and became a horrifying execution practice from East Asia to Europe. The condemned would be stripped and then dipped into a large vat filled with boiling liquid, commonly water, but sometimes oil or tar. This inflicted excruciating pain, and their flesh burned and organs cooked from the inside out, filling the air with the stench of burning flesh. Blood eagle. This was a supposed execution method and was both symbolic and sadistic. The victim would be laid prone as their back was slashed open, creating bloody wings. Executioners would then sever the ribs from the spine, fracturing them and twisting them upwards like spread wings. Salt would be ground into the wounds, inflicting excruciating pain. The lungs would be pulled out through the broken ribs and draped over them. While prominent in Viking legends and modern media, evidence for its actual practice is scant. Lingchi. Also known as slow slicing or death by 1,000 cuts, Lingchi was a horrific execution method used in China for almost a millennium. From the 10th century until its ban in 1905, the condemned person endured prolonged barbaric torture, tied to a poster frame, while the executioner meticulously removed small pieces of flesh, muscle, or limbs with sharp knives. Each cut inflicted deliberate and agonizing pain, expertly administered to maximize suffering and prolong the victim's life. Taunting and displaying severed body parts added to the brutality, with the ordeal lasting hours or even days. The final cut, often across the chest or a blow to the head, brought a merciful end to the prolonged torture.